Hello, fellas. Today we'll be talking about something a bit more on the somber side. I want to be treating this with all the nuance, care, and respect that the subject deserves. We'll be talking about the ongoing wars, mostly the Slavic one. Why talk about this? It seems mostly pointless, even disrespectful, to be talking about real suffering, to be talking about it and using it as an intellectual exercise, which this will be, in all honesty. It's not going to move the needle in any capsule of the world. This is not going to do anything right. The point of talking about this is that there are lessons to be gleaned, and the greater the tragedy, the greater the impact and the gravity of those lessons. So, those lessons would help us prevent things happening of this calamitous nature. And while I don't want to reduce the suffering by saying that everything has a silver lining, I do want to say that as humans, we do try to find these things, these lessons, and all these amidst suffering, right? So that the suffering is not repeated in the future. And that would be the attempt. Even as I say this, I do want to start us off with expressing our respect, expressing my respect and my sincerest condolences to all the fallen souls on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side, and also for that matter, on the Israeli side and on the Gazan side. People are dying. It's brutal. It's savage. And we as a species need to figure out a way to resolve our conflicts without debasing ourselves in the worst manner possible by just becoming the worst of ourselves. So, with that context, I want to start us off. The talk is going to be in three sections. One is the what and the why. What's the current landscape? And then we talk about the potential solutions and the lessons to be learned from this. The what and the why. I want to start us off with a tweet that I saw by someone a long time back. So this piece has been sitting in my notes for some time. I was initially planning to write this piece out, but never really got a chance. I just needed to tie a few loose ends before I could have done that. Never really found the time to do that. And I was just, and I read something about Ukraine yesterday and something about Israel yesterday, and that just got me thinking that okay, I think it's time to talk about these things, even as they weigh very heavily on my heart. I can't even imagine how heavily they must weigh on the hearts of the people who are in the midst of this. I want to start us off with this tweet by someone who is ostensibly a Ukrainian living in America. So this paints quite a bleak picture, so bear with me. She says that she just got back from Ukraine where she was visiting some friends. This was a while back, this was I think 6 months back, maybe a bit before then. And what she says in the tweet is that everything we've heard, so I'm just going to utter these words as if I'm her. Everything we've heard about what's happening in Ukraine is a lie. The reality is darker, bleaker, and unequivocally hopeless. There's no such thing as Ukraine winning this war. By the estimates, they've lost over 1 million of their sons, fathers, and husbands. An entire generation is gone. Even in the southwest, where the anti-Russian sentiment is long-standing, citizens are reluctant or straight up scared to publicly criticize Zelensky or they'll go to jail. In every village or town, the streets and shops and restaurants are mostly absent of man. The few men who remain are terrified of leaving their homes for fear of being kidnapped into conscription. Some have resorted rather, to begging friends to break their legs to want service. Army search parties take place early in the morning when men leave their homes to go to work. They ambush and kidnap them off the streets, and within 3-4 hours they get listed in the army and taken away straight to the front lines with minimal or no training at all. It is a death sentence. It's getting worse every day. Now where I was saying, Dennis had just been taken by security forces on his way to work, leaving behind 2 small children. Every day, 3 to 5 dead bodies keep arriving from the front lines. Mothers and wives fight tooth and nail with the armed forces, beg and plead not to have their men taken away. They try bribing, which sometimes works, but most of the time they're met with physical violence and death threats. The territory celebrated as having been won back from Russia has been reduced to rubble and is uninhabitable. Regardless, there's no one left to live. Then displaced families will never likely. There's lots of these. I don't want to go through everything. It will take a long time. I'll just touch upon the major points made here. Wars. No, they see the way the war has been reported at home and abroad. It's a joke and propaganda. They say, look around, is it winning? Wars, somehow being hoaxed into believing that once Ukrainian forces are exhausted, American soldiers will come in to replace them and win the war. There is no ambiguity in these people. The war was for nothing, a travesty. The outcome always was and is clear. The people are hopeless, utterly destroyed, and living in an unending nightmare. They're pleading for an end, any end, most likely the same peace that could have been achieved 2 years ago. In their minds, they're already lost, for their sons, husbands, fathers are gone, and the country has been destroyed. There's no victory that can change that. Make no mistake, they're angry with Putin, but they're also angry with Zelensky and the West. They've lost everything, worst of all, hope and faith, and cannot comprehend why Zelensky wishes to continue the current trajectory, the one of human devastation. I didn't witness the war. What I saw was absolutely heart-shattering. Shame on the people, regardless of the intentions, who supported this war, and shame on the media for continuing to lie about it. When the first community note was removed, another one popped up, questioning the consistent feedback conveyed to me from many people inside Ukraine that the real death toll could be as high as 1 million. They would know. In some villages, 70% of households have lost family members to this war. To clarify, I'm not saying this is fact. I'm sharing what I've been consistently told by real people living in Ukraine, that the total number of casualties is around 1 million people. This could... I didn't plan to cry. When I was writing this, I didn't cry, but I don't know. I don't know what's happened to me. I'm sorry about that. It's too much. It's too much. Oh gosh, no. Yeah, so that's the account of this person who visited Ukraine. Now, these are my notes. So now and then this could be false, right? This could be written by Russian Vatnik for Russian propaganda, right? This could be yeah, this could be written by Russian, I think. But you look at reports by Western media, you look at reports by the Ukrainian military, and you see that the numbers there are not as far off as you might think. It's not 1 million, but it's not 100,000, 200,000 either. It's a lot more than that. Yeah, Ukraine is in dire states no matter how you slice it. Yeah, and again, what prompted me to have this discussion, this talk broadcasted to the world is reading an article about, well, a couple of articles yesterday about, a few actually, about the wars going on, but a couple of them were about Ukraine. One was about the forced conscription bill that was passed in Ukraine that will mean that even people as young as 24, 25, they can be taken in by the Ukrainian military. They'll be forced to fight and they'll be forced to die. And the second was, I think, an article published in the BBC, which is obviously very sympathetic to Ukrainian causes. Gosh, it's very difficult to talk about these things. But that article was about how Ukraine doesn't really have a cat and hell's chance of winning. And it's only going to get worse. That's the belief that many military strategists hold, many geopolitical experts hold. They look at things which are happening on the ground. Ukraine is on the verge of losing. It's not a done deal. It could still fight a more One more year, maybe a couple, but it's getting closer and closer to the end game. It never had to be this way. It never had to be this way. So you got to ask the question, right? You got to ask the question: why are they continuing with the amidst all this devastation, decimation, catastrophe, tragedy? Why continue, right? They are continuing for the same reason that you would continue if you're attacked by Putin's barbaric designs. They are continuing for God, for glory, for nation, for freedom, for their family, for the people they love. But a nation is its population, right? The question you got to ask is the aims of Ukraine, as they are stated by the military, are to get back the territory, right? That requires expending human lives. It's not going to be free. In life, as in wars, there are trade offs with everything, right? That's going to involve losing a lot of your people, your precious people. Now, the interesting, yeah, the way to phrase this, I think, to gain some clarity, to gain some clarity into your moral calculus, is how many square meters of land is each soldier's life worth, right? When you put it that way, it makes things very clear. Because land is just land, and people, now those are worth fighting for. If those are being expended the way they are, now I'm not. Again, I do want to make it very clear that I completely get the absolute anger, the absolute wrath, the absolute pride that Ukrainians have, and understand why they want to keep fighting. But I also want to look at the ground reality. When we look at the fact that, back in the day when people used to fight until death, well, nations, when societies, when cultures used to fight to the bitter end, the population pyramids used to look very different from what they're looking for the Russians and for the Ukrainians and for a lot of nations, right? The inverted pyramids, your young people are your greatest assets, and there's a turning point. You can call it the crisis point. If you cross that point, you cease to exist as a nation because the nation is not your territory. It is the people, it is the culture, and the culture is kept alive by the people. This is something which, again, I understand. My heart goes out to those people who want to keep on fighting. But again, I take us back to the point that if you don't have people, if you don't have a future, what's the point of winning back territory? There's nothing more essential to the Ukrainian people's future than people who are present and who are going to inhabit the future. If you're expending those, that is not a good calculation. Without those people, Ukraine might have all the land, might have all the Russian land, but it's not going to be worth the land it is. How much is a human life worth? What amount of land area is one 18-year-old Ukrainian's life worth? This is the calculus that Ukrainians are dealing with, the Ukrainian government has to deal with. They're not putting these in explicit terms. I don't know why. Because these people also would have the best records of birth rates and fertility and the migration rates and how many people they expect to come back to Ukraine. If this goes beyond a certain point in time, Ukraine as a nation ceases to exist. Asking this question, that how much is a human life worth, clarifies the madness and the calculus, or the lack of the calculus. The Ukrainians seem to be the government, the people, the military brass, they seem to be ignoring the ground reality. The wars is about people and they don't have people. If you want to fight the zeroth principle, the fundamental principle, the art of war, go back to the first principle. Even if you start from first principles, the first principle would be to stay alive if you want to win. As the iconic Warren Buffett statement goes, if you want to win in the stock market, you got to stay alive. If you want to win in the markets of nations, you got to stay alive. And that's the thing that Ukraine is failing at most miserably because of some very short-sighted, because of what seems to me short-sighted decision making on the side of the military. Because again, it's the responsibility of the military, of the government, to communicate to the people that Our fertility rates, they're not the greatest. We don't have a lot of kids. We don't have a lot of young people. I don't think it's sensible for us to continue in the vein that we've been continuing. I think we gotta recalibrate, we gotta reorganize, we gotta look back, we gotta look at how we can best get our aims over a longer span of time. Because in the shorter span of time, the strategy that we've got, it leads to a dead end, a literal dead end. Just want to make a quick note about America, right? So they might seem that America is going to come to save them. A lot of Ukrainians might think that it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. America doesn't care about Ukraine anymore than it cared about Vietnam. It cares more about defeating, about pummeling Russia. And if Ukraine is the proxy, then, well, so be it. No nation has friends, only interests, and the American interest lies in weakening Russia to the maximum extent possible. It does not extend beyond anything beyond that. Sure, there are a lot of people with great hearts in the United States who want to see Ukraine flourish, don't get me wrong, but as a government, they don't care about it. I also want to quickly make a note about the brutality of it, the butchery of it, right? The first thing to go to war, the first thing to go when the war drums reach fever pitch is our humanity, our sense of compassion, morality. Someone said this somewhere during war times. It is so true. During war times, hearts grow brutal, right? Russians and Ukrainians, they're cousins. You cannot imagine the kind of brutality that, well, the Russians started it, sure. And they've obviously done the worst of it, the atrocities in Bucha and what they've done. But you cannot believe the atrocities that these people are able to subject Ukrainians to, subject their cousins to. It doesn't make any sense. The question I pose is, if the Ukrainian people were told, if they were shown the reality of the landscape, in the sense that this is the number of people we've got, this is how much it would take, roughly speaking, even in the best of universes, to be able to get back Donbass and what's the other name? What's the other region? I don't remember. Kherson, I think. Kherson and Donbass. I don't think that's it, but those two oblasts, just to get those two back would take 100,000 lives, and then Crimea would take 500,000, right? Let's say that those numbers were put to the Ukrainian people, and then those people have to make a decision that, do we want to, trade away our lives? Do we want to trade away the lives of our son? Do we want to trade the life of our partner, of our husband, for what? Land? Yeah. I think to me, what it seems is that this goes back to the Zelensky peace formula, right? Which was that the Russians must leave every square inch of the land. Now, obviously, I understand it from a game theoretic perspective. You want to state your maximalist aims because the opposing party is never going to come meet you there. You're always going to have a compromise. So I completely get that. But if that is truly something they believe in, and there are reasons to believe that that is something that they truly want, then I think that's suicidal. And I think that tells me that the Zelensky government wants a forever war. So again, I want to be as charitable as possible to the people involved in the war, but there's also facts, and the facts are that Ukraine was one of the most corrupt nations in Europe. A lot of European corrupt Ukrainian government officials who filled their pockets and their coffers with the money coming in from the United States and Europe. And they would want this war to continue because their sons and daughters, they're not in Ukraine. So there are only a small number of people who decide whether this war goes on or not. Let's be very clear about that. It's not the Ukrainian people who are deciding that. Ukrainian people, if they are shown the facts, I don't know whether they would change their mind, but I suspect many of them would, probably majority of them would, right? Because they care more about the long-term prosperity of the nation, they would, than in the short term getting back some land. Which is going to I think in the head of Zelensky, he probably thinks of himself as a savior or a messiah. He's got the messiah complex. And people with that kind of a complex, They want to stay. He knows that. Again, I want to be extremely charitable. I'm just saying that this could be a potential thing that could be a factor. And because Zelensky is literally the most important person on this puzzle piece, and the reason I say that is because Putin's not going to budge off, right? So he's not, in a way, he's a non-factor in how this war proceeds because the Russian apparatus is honed in towards trying to slice away Ukraine as much as possible. So that's only always going to be focused. Even if you took out Putin tomorrow with the sniper, that's not going to change anything, right? But Zelensky, on the other hand, he literally could say, make a speech tomorrow that, okay, I think for the good of our people, for the long-term prosperity of our nation, I want the battle lines to be, I want the military zone, so DMZ, to be drawn at our current lines, battle lines, and yeah, so he could make that speech and that would be the end of the war, right? But I think he wants a forever war. The leadership wants a forever war. And the Putin leadership, or the American leadership for that matter, wouldn't mind that either, right? Because again, a lot of people are getting filthy rich with this. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Yeah, a lot of people are not letting this go to waste. It's not a crisis for them, it's just a crisis for a lot of ordinary people, but they are making good use of it. 21 minutes, okay, gotta wrap it up quick. Most common people, most ordinary people, want the bloodshed to end, want the brutality and the butchery to end. And they, I think, would see sense in something that the players, the main players, don't want to happen. I just want to share a quote, which I think is very relevant over here. War is a racket. It always has been. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few, at the expense of the very many. Of war, a few people make huge fortunes. This was said by some major General Smedley D. Butler. I think there could be a lot of truth as it pertains to the current situation in Ukraine and in Israel for that matter, in Gaza for that matter. Yeah, the Ukrainian birth rates are plummeting. They gotta think about the long-term prosperity of the nation, because this is just a no-win strategy. They can keep throwing everything they've got. They can literally throw everything at this, and Russia would still win. That's the calculus that we've got, that they've got to face. Right. So, okay, that's settled. Now, let's move on to the next part. I want to talk about the solutions to this war, right? Also want to briefly touch upon the Israeli-Gaza conflict. The reason I smile is that that's obviously a no-go for many people. Just going to briefly touch upon it. Should I? We'll see at the end. But I guess if we had to talk about it, we're going to talk about it right now. Okay, let me briefly touch upon it, right? Now, when that particular conflict, well, escalated, because it has been an ongoing conflict for about hundreds of years, I don't know how long, in different shapes and forms for a long time, right? Now, escalated on the 7th of October, Israel had a lot of sympathy from a lot of quarters. What happened then is they allowed a madman, a psychopath, to create the response. And the response is one of the worst seen in the history of the planet. Not seeing these kinds of things, this kind of brutality happen. Sure, people are comparing it to the brutality in Yemen or places like that, Syria. You gotta understand that this was a liberal democracy, but somewhat liberal, right? And people got different expectations from liberal democracies. And okay, this is not a liberal government, sure, still a liberal democracy. And people, well, liberals and progressives, they couldn't believe the kind of aggression that the idea showed. Now, briefly want to touch upon that, right? There were solutions, and I don't want to go into too deep into this. There were good solutions, even at that point in time. So the one thing that I spoke to with a few people when we are talking about these kinds of things, as one does, is that the best solution at that point in time, without being to not show the other cheek, but to work with the people, right? Because Hamas is one thing, but a lot of people, they would be sympathetic to the Israelis wanting their own state and sovereignty, right? So you got to work with those people. I think the best solution for them at that point in time would have been to prop up sympathetic elements in Gaza and then have that form a government and then work with them. Sure, there would be a lot of anger on the right wing of the Israeli extreme radical right wing, but when you're operating based on what they want, you already failed to a large degree. So it was always a no-go. But again, there's a lot of nuance here. There's the point I was trying to raise is, again, I'm talking about the solutions. I just want to briefly talk about the solutions, right? The Israeli government is the biggest deterrent to peace. The Joe Biden government, the UK government, all these governments have been wanting a separate state for Palestine. Now they don't want that to happen. Again, a lot of nuance to be discussed here. I don't want to we would be here for the entire night if we go into that. But the Israeli government, well, especially Netanyahu, he has been a real obstruction to a two-state solution. You can find a video clip of his talking about how for him to be with his kind of political philosophy, for him to be in power, he needs to have a separate Gaza and a separate West Bank, and he needs to have Hamas in that Gaza, and they can never have a two-state solution for, yeah. So he's obviously been one of the biggest obstructions to peace. I think one of the solutions was that people to people bridges are the best solutions, right? So people should be talking to each other, people should be connecting. Because governments want to divide, they want to stay in power. Governments in certain contexts, they want to divide, well, in most contexts actually, they want to divide because in division you get groups that align to your ideology and then you can get to, well, message to them and you stay in power. So that's been how governments have been doing these things for the longest time. But so you gotta think beyond the paradigm of how do you solve this particular complex problem beyond the paradigm of governments, right? So I think the solution would have been for Israeli NGOs, Israeli organizations to work on the ground with Gazans, to educate them that we are here, well, even longer than our religion is anyways. And this is our homeland. You're not going to go away. We also want to see you prosper. We don't want you to not have a nation. We want you to have a nation, a prosperous nation. We want to live with you side by side as brothers and sisters. For that to happen, though, we need to stop this division happening from the top, right? So I think that was the solution. The people-to-people bridges, they tend to be the best solutions. They have not been implemented because it would have been difficult to implement these back before the age of social media, before the age of internet. But I think these would have been some really effective solutions. Because parties have ideologies and they want to win, right? And compromise is a way to peace, but they don't want that because if there's compromise, they don't feel as much in power, and compromise requires them to give away some of the power. Right, so that was a brief note on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Let's get our focus back on the Russian-Ukraine war, right? So what's the solution here? Because Russia is going to keep on pummeling and keep on battering. The government is, to use that word, monstrous. They don't care about human life. Putin doesn't care about it. He's a savage. He's a butcher. So we gotta be realistic, right? We can talk about, oh, he's so horrible, he's so this, the government is so this, the army is so this, but that doesn't take us anywhere because people are still dying. What you gotta focus on is solutions. And the solution here is the ball is in Ukraine's court. That's pretty clear to me. Again, I could be wrong about everything I've said in this talk, but based on what I have read, based on what I think these are pretty solid statements propped up by pretty solid facts and sentiments. The sentiments matter a lot in war times. Emotions matter a lot. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So what's the solution? If the ball is in Ukraine's court, should they give up? I don't think they should give up. I don't think they need to give up. I think they gotta reframe this as a long-term war or as a long-term struggle. So the struggle would be, okay, let's talk about the aim, right? So Ukraine wants to get back its lands. Russia wants to get more of it, so it wants to keep the current amount of territory won, and probably wants to gain more, but they would be happy if they didn't get any more, right? So that's the landscape. That's the canvas upon which we are having this discussion. Now, for Ukraine, to get more territory means doing it with the most important resource that you've got, right? So that's a pretty bad deal, in my estimation. If you had a lot of young people, if you had an if you had a proper pyramid with a lot of young people, sure, I mean, even in that case, bloodshed is just wrong. It's just evil in my eyes. But sometimes you gotta die for freedom, I guess. There's 300 Spartans, right? Yeah. So I get that. But when it comes to survival, you should never do that, because if you don't survive, you're never gonna win. You're already out of the game. So what you gotta optimize for, what you gotta always place at the top of your priority is survival, and then everything else should be below that. Ukraine is, yeah, they can say that, okay, we're gonna keep on doing what we've been doing, and they lose more people. Russia loses more people, and the end of the facts will win out, right? So Russia's got a lot more manpower. Russia's got a lot more weaponry. So you know how that's gonna turn out for Ukraine. There's not going to be no peace. It's just going to be more lives needlessly lost. No, I think the Ukrainians should focus more on the future, focus on building a free and thriving nation, right? So I think we should take a cue from Americans building up Germany post-war, or Americans building up, helping up build up Japan post-war, right? And they also helped Vietnam for that matter. So there's a precedent for this. And America are obviously very close allies to Ukraine. And they're also pretty rich compared to back then, which means that they would have a lot more to give to help Ukraine become a thriving nation. It could also happen much faster, right? So if I were the Ukrainian leader, what I would do is I would not surrender. I would say that, okay, let's have a ceasefire, or maybe not a ceasefire, but let's say that, okay, I'm going to join NATO, I'm going to stop this war, I'm going to say that, okay, we'll freeze the current wars, the current lines, if I join NATO tomorrow, if I join EU tomorrow. So I think they would be happy with that, right? Because the reason the reason US doesn't want Ukraine in NATO at this moment in time is that obviously that would mean that Russia is now fighting with NATO, and then the Article 5 has to kick in, and then obviously the Americans and the Europeans have to intervene. So that's just going to, well, lead to World War III, lead to a nuclear exchange, right? So no one wants that. But if Ukraine says, okay, let's just freeze the current lines of conflict, we're not trying to take back our territory, not yet, let's just freeze these, but I have to be NATO by yesterday. So that's what I would do. And then the second thing I would focus on, so that would be my first step. And as soon as I've actually gotten the approval, now actually as soon as I'm part of NATO, actually I communicated this to Russians, right, that, okay, your people are dying, and you've got to take a very human perspective on this, right? Because you can just bark at each other while the message is going to not get through at all. You can say that you vicious bastard, or you XXX, or you whatever, right? You can just use the worst language and it's not gonna do anything. Then you gotta just communicate this at a human level that, look, Russia, you're also losing one of your greatest assets, because while Ukraine's fertility rate is horrible, Russia's is not much better. Demographically speaking, Russia is also pretty doomed. So they also want to put an end to this as soon as they can, right? So they are invested in getting this done as soon as possible. The way to make that happen would be to tell Russia that, okay, let's just stop this madness, let's just stop this barbarity, but in return, because I want you still my neighbor, I want security guarantees, I'm going to join NATO. Now, if you're true to your word that you don't want any more territory, then you wouldn't mind that. And also, after what you've done, it just makes sense for us to do this. If you hadn't done it before, we wouldn't have done it before. But at this point, it's just a necessity. No, we don't. So that's what you would say, right? Now, obviously, that I'm assuming that Russians would be sensible enough to take this offer. For them, I guess they would be happy with what they've got. I guess their concern would be, again, Ukraine on NATO weapons in Ukraine. But after what they've done, sure, anything short of victory for them would have meant NATO weapons. I mean, there are still scenarios where that needn't have happened, but if Ukraine was still a functioning nation at the end of any of those scenarios, it was always going to be part of NATO. So sure, they would have, again, military strategists tend to think of all different possible, well, most likely, most 100 most likely scenarios, let's say. And surely this would have been in many of those scenarios, right? So I think they would be willing to, because they also tend to gain a lot from this, right? So some nations will probably lift the sanctions as soon as the war ends. Some nations will be happy to lift sanctions. Some will continue to have the sanctions on. Their trades will improve because now they can sell to more people. The military, the people can be more focused on other things rather than having a wartime economy. This tends to be pretty bad for your economy's health. So they've obviously got to win. Not being in a war is a win for any player. Like, you can't win in a war. That's an old adage. It's very true. It's very true. So that's what I would do, and then I would focus very much on bringing back or focusing on women empowerment, right? Because the thing that Ukraine doesn't have is people. So they gotta again think of 20 years ahead. They just gotta create many women friendly policies, mother friendly policies, just make it a really the best policies for those kinds of things, right? Again, USA should fund many of these things because USA got a lot out of this. So just as a humanitarian cause, they should fund this. So Ukraine in 20 years' time, they could be a thriving um, country with a lot of young people, just and their pyramid is becoming healthier. So I think that would be the best thing that they can do, right? And then I think in the longer term, what they could do is if Russia keeps on making these stupid choices like electing tyrants like Putin, I don't think it has a good future, to be honest, right? Sure, wars tend to be the time where the probability of these kinds of nations breaking apart is the highest, but there are still things which can happen even in peace times which can lead to all sorts of things, right? I mean, we've seen this USSR that breakup happened during the peacetime. These things have happened, right? So there could be a civil war in Russia in the next few years. All sorts of things could happen. There could be a revolt from the people. Russia, if it continues in the same authoritarian tyrant vein, it could become a much weaker nation if it doesn't fix its perennial problems, its population problems. It could be in a horrible shape 20 years in the future. And then Ukraine can leverage its economy, leverage its economic heft to be able to gain the territory back, right? So I think they got out. That's the only way that they come out on top, relatively speaking. I don't see any other way in which it's a good outcome for them. I mean, even this is not a good outcome. I don't want to obviously downplay the suffering, but after everything that's happened, I think this could be the least worst of all the possible outcomes for them. Right. So that's that. Yeah, I want to quickly talk about how do you solve for wars, right? We're in 38 minutes in. I didn't mean to go on for so long. Let's just quickly talk about how can we solve for wars. So in a multipolar world, the only way out of a potential planet-sized catastrophe is through staggered de-escalation of the major armies. So what this means in essence is that America and China decide, okay, so right now we got X and Y number of warheads. We keep on proportionally decreasing them, bring them to zero. All the nations decide to do that, right? So that would be one. And then if you want to solve wars, we got to agree that that's literally the worst of all possible things, right? The wars are evil, wars are unnecessary, and we should do anything else to solve our conflicts, our problems. We should never ever resort to wars, right? So there's always more of a philosophical revolution because wars are still in some circles acceptable, right? We need to deal with that. So that would be one part of it. Once we agree that firing even a single shot is wrong and unacceptable, that's when we start to see real changes and solutions emerge. A page could be taken from the India-China border agreement, where both these nations have got, I think, some agreements that no one carries a rifle, no one carries any machine gun, no one carries any, what do you call those kinds of guns? Anything with bullets, right? People, the best they can carry are clubs, and what that means is that it takes into account the flawed nature of humans, right? Where even a tiny miscalculation by an Indian soldier or a Chinese soldier could lead to World War III erupting. And before you know it, before the next sunrise, you got a couple of 100 million people dead. So, yeah, these nations understand that human nature is flawed. It can escalate at any point in time. So we gotta work with that in mind. So, based on that, because human nature is flawed, and human nature is notoriously difficult to shift. Sure, I mean, I really shouldn't say that because back in the day, in our hundreds of years back, we used to be savages, right? Our ancestors, 10,000 years back, they used to be savages. We used to raid. Vikings, for example, they used to raid and rape and do all sorts of things. So people evolve now. The Scandinavians, they're literally the most egalitarian society, the most feminist society in the entire world. So to go from having a reputation of being the most vicious people, rapists, to becoming the most feminist society, that tells you there's a lot of scope for improvement for any civilization, any culture. And that's promising. But human nature is still very, very difficult to budge. So, what I propose is, seeing how deeply entrenched human nature is, I think letting AI take over our military probably is the best thing that we can do, and which removes the barbarity out of it, which removes the emotion out of it. Yeah, I know, and I can go wrong in so many ways. Yeah, that was a joke. That was a joke. No, it could work. It could work. If we do develop an AGI that is aligned to the things that we agree upon, long-term prosperity and peace of humankind, empathy. No, the AGI is empathetic. The AGI understands. Well, I mean, it's empathetic. So the AGI understands why we are who we are and what we do. Understands us that it really loves us, right? As a god would. With that kind of an AGI, I think you can place all the weapons of the world under its jurisdiction or under its control, and you could sleep easy, knowing that no war is ever going to happen, no conflict is ever going to happen, no murder is ever going to happen. Well, not with bullets, anyways. But jokes aside, if you don't want to go down that route, at least for the next few years, next few decades, until we are comfortable with that, I think in a more serious sense, a real solution would be to abolish all the militaries at the same time, right? So let's say we decide that in 2030, we are going to abolish our military. Every nation makes this pledge, and they mean to do it. So until that point, obviously people stop expanding the military, but as soon as that point happens, all the military assets are then sent to a peacekeeping force, which could be run by a world government like organization, right? A revamped world government organization that this peacekeeping force only works defensively, not offensively, and the only forces it has to ever work against are non-state actors, who would be the only groups that would still have access to weapons, right? And over time, you obviously, with the power of this peacekeeping force, you'll have the best of the best from every nation. They'll be able to eradicate these non-state actors across the globe, which would leave us probably in 50 years with a world that's completely peaceful. There's no conflict, there's no scope for conflict, right? Because if all you can fight with are knives, you're obviously not going to fight, right? You're not going to go to destroy Russia. So I think this appears to me to be the very best solution, and by a country mile. Nothing even comes close. I've thought about this quite a bit about other potential solutions, but this just seems so far and away the very best, the very optimal. This obviously requires us to rise to the high angel of our natures, trusting other governments to do that bit, trusting other governments not to have secret weapons. But I think it's eminently possible, especially with the stakes that we've got. Right? I mean, if this goes wrong, it's the end of civilization. So I think we can rise to this level. I think we can rise to the level of the high angels of our nature, because we must. With that note, I thank you for your time.